Oh yeah, we're going to record the session. Somebody was just commenting they have to leave early. Um, that's fine. Um, okay, Roz, maybe you could spotlight me and we'll get started. Welcome all. This program is being brought to you by the Israel-Palestine Committee of Boston Workers Circle. We are very pleased at tonight's turnout. My name is Helen Raisin, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Israel-Palestine Committee at Boston Workers Circle. For those of you who might be unfamiliar, Boston Workers Circle is a community and spiritual home for secular Jewish life, a voice for progressive Jewish values and social change, a multi-generational arts and education center celebrating Yiddish, Jewish, and progressive culture. The people who built the Workers' Circle were Jews who fled the poverty, oppression, and rising violence of Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They came to America to build new lives, a vibrant Yiddish culture and secular Jewish identity, and an American Jewish left. Their story is also our story, our roots, our legacy, and the foundation upon which we build Boston Workers' Circle today. The Israel-Palestine Committee of Boston Workers Circle is part of our social justice work and operates based on a set of principles posted on our website, which will also be, the link will be posted to that in the chat. But a short quote, we believe only the complete and equal respect of all Jewish and Palestinian rights is compatible with our social values and Jewish traditions, unquote. In October of 2023, because we called for a ceasefire in Gaza, Boston Workers Circle was kicked out of the Jewish Community Relations Council, an organization we were founding members of. In the past couple of years, we've been involved with others in the coalition Together for an Inclusive Massachusetts, or TIM, formed to advocate for Massachusetts policymakers to address anti-Semitism using an anti-racist solidarity framework. Tim rejects partisan efforts to exclude Jewish people who are critical of Israel or to redefine anti-Semitism in a way that harms Palestinians. One of the other member organizations of Tim is Concerned Jewish Faculty and Staff of the Boston area, and they have published a shadow report to the one produced by the State Special Commission on Combating Anti-Semitism. A month ago, several members of BWC, along with others, delivered a copy of this shadow report to every Massachusetts legislator and to the elected state officers, along with a letter endorsing the Concerned Jewish Faculty and Staff report that was signed by BWC along with 9 other Jewish organizations. Concerned Jewish faculty and staff also offered some suggested speaker topics, and our topic and speaker tonight is a member of both Boston Workers Circle and Concerned Jewish faculty and staff. In addition to our work with Tim, the IPC and BWC are active in the Massachusetts Synagogue Network on Israel-Palestine, and we welcome MSNIT members who have joined us this evening. Hasia Dyer is going to speak for 25 minutes, and then we will have 25 minutes of Q&A with Hasia that I will moderate. And following that, we'll have some breakout sessions so people can have some individual discussion. Please use the Q&A box to post questions for Hasia. If you don't see it on your screen, go to the More button at the bottom and find it there, and that'll bring it up on your bottom of your screen. I've set up the Q&A so everybody can see the posted questions, and you should be able to vote for questions you like. Now I'll turn things over to Karen Klein, my fellow co-chair, who is going to introduce Hasia.
Hi, hi, hi everyone. I'm Karen Klein. I'm the co-chair with Helen for the IPC committee. And I am delighted to introduce Professor Hasia Diner, member of the Boston Worker Circle and also a member of the board of the National Worker Circle. And it was my good fortune to meet her here in Brookline after she moved from New York City, where we worked together to lobby for National WC to support a ceasefire statement regarding Gaza in 2023. And I can paraphrase and say it seems like it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And I've been really happy to have met her. If I'd known her bio beforehand, I would have been much more intimidated. But she is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, and this was her position before retiring here to Brookline. She's the author of a number of books in American Jewish history and American immigration history, three of which have won the National Jewish Book Award. There is a link in the chat for her Wikipedia page where you can see the several books that she has written. This semester, she will be teaching a course on American Judaism at the Harvard Divinity School. A former Guggenheim Fellow, she is pleased to be spending part of her retirement involved with the BWC and with Boston Worker Circle and with other organizations advocating for justice. And we are pleased that she's brought her academic skills and her activism to us here in Boston. So with that, I give you Hasia.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank everybody who's out there. I don't see you, but I'm generally not a fan of speaking on Zoom, but that is life in the world today. So I'm going to be talking about Jewish opposition to Zionism. Now, I'm going to be really focusing on an earlier period. And if you want to read and learn more about more recent, and for me, more recent is since Israeli statehood, 1948, I highly recommend Marjorie Feld's book, The Limits of Dissent. But I'm going to be moving further back in time. And although I'm moving back further in time, I think you'll hear the echoes of some of the debates that we are hearing around us and some of the rhetoric that we feel that we, particularly through this committee, feel the need to respond to. So, Jewish opposition to Zionism. So, first, let me begin by saying that opposition to Zionism and Zionism were age mates. That is, there was no Zionism without opposition to it. And much of the opposition, particularly what I'm going to be talking about today, came from Jews who were deeply concerned about the safety of the Jewish people around the world and the fostering of Jewish culture. In other words, the people that I'm going to be dealing with were not the sort of self-hating, uninvolved, apathetic kind of Jewish masses, which Zionists tended to describe them as. Okay, but rather these were people who devoted their time, their money, their energy, their whatever political clout they had to the furtherance of Jews and Jewish culture. Now, I think I need 1 minute, maybe two, to just lay out first what was Zionism? What does Zionism articulate as a vision? And certainly, if you had 10 historians, modern Jewish historians here, they'd all give 10 different answers. And so these will be mine. And I'm going to premise the answer on a very ironic note, which is that Zionism was an avowedly secular movement. In other words, secular in the sense that it said human beings had the right to define their destiny and to take their destiny in their own hands, and they didn't wait for some kind of divine providential involvement. So it was a secular movement, but it was based on a deeply theological principle that Jews had a particular stake and a particular yearning and a particular affinity for a chunk of real estate, that is what they would have called the Holy Land in Palestine. So the basic premises of Zionism were first a return to the homeland, and by the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s, there's beginnings of talk about sovereignty, about having an actual state. Okay, they, for the most part, believed that the diaspora was a disaster. It was inherently anti-Semitic, and that everything that the diaspora had produced nothing of value, and that the Zionist project was what they called in Hebrew shlilat galut, the negation of the diaspora. They believed Jews were a nation, and like any nation, like Czechs and Irish and Hungarians and Serbians and Poles, they deserved a state. Okay, and it is notable that Zionism as a political movement developed while all these other nationalisms were roiling the global scene. So Jews were a nation, and that when they created this center, this state, this homeland in Palestine, it would speak for all the Jews of the world. It would create a culture, a Jewish culture that was not dependent upon any outside forces. Okay, now again, there were many variations on this. Okay, over the course of the Zionist movement as a movement begins in 1897 with the calling of the first Zionist Congress, which was held in Basel, Switzerland. And in the decades that followed it, it is notable that most American Jews, most American Jewish organizations had little or no interest in Zionism. They created schools, hospitals, federations, charitable societies, magazines, clubs, all sorts of institutions that had either nothing to say about Zionism or opposed it in one way or another. So Zionism was in the United States always a minority movement. It certainly began to gain steam in the late 1930s with the refugee crisis, but at no time did a majority of Americans belong to an avowedly Jewish Zionist organization. Interestingly, this was true even in Poland, and I'm going to talk a little bit as I can in this sort of time I have about Poland, but I'll just say that in the last parliamentary elections held in Poland before World War II, it was 1938, 1939, the Zionists did pretty badly at the polls. That is, when Jews went to vote, there were lots of Jewish parties, because Jews didn't have to vote for a Jewish party, but when they voted for a Jewish party, the Zionists did not do pretty well, and the biggest winner was the Bund, the left, and the Bund captured the majority of both Warsaw and Łódź, and 89 different towns. The Zionists captured no geographic space, so Zionism was a minority movement. Now, in the course of the 25 minutes that I have, what I want to do is sketch out, and again, this could be 2 or 3 hours, which I'm sure you wouldn't want to sit through, but in the course of these 25 minutes, I'm going to look in a very broad brush at 3 blocks, okay, 3 swaths of Jewry, American and otherwise, which opposed Zionism. I'm not going to even be dealing with those who just didn't say anything, like the B'nai B'rith, which was just silent on Zionism. So of these 3 swaths, one is the religiously Orthodox. They're a very important part of this story. Reform, primarily in America, but in Germany also. And I'm going to call this the integrationist bloc. Okay, it's heavily associated with Reform Judaism. And then the leftist bloc, which is very much, I will tell it very much from the point of view of the Bund. So here are 3 very different iterations of Judaism. They each had their own reasons for opposing Zionism. They all had their own rationale, and they all advanced their own projects to stymie the advance of Zionism. Now, it is notable that those who oppose Zionism, look at, again, they're so different from the Agudah to the Bund. They had no name. There was no such word as anti-Zionist. They didn't have a party. They didn't have a platform. They each operated in their own way to advance an agenda that was an alternative to the Zionists. Okay, so now, again, just before I get into the 3, let me say that all 3 of these, the Reform integrationist position, the Bund leftist position, the Orthodox position, particularly as an organized political entity, and the Zionists all owed their existence to a particularly cataclysmic moment in Jewish history. And it was the twin forces of emancipation. Jews could now begin to participate in the secular general world of the societies they lived in, England, France, Germany, and so on, and the growth of a certain kind of anti-Semitism. So with these twin forces of emancipation, and there may be some questions about that, and anti-Semitism, Jews, Zionists, and their opponents all asked the same question. Okay, and the question was actually distilled in a pamphlet by a Polish Jewish writer, and the title of it was Le'an. Where to? What do we do? How do Jews shape their destiny in this brand new world for which they really don't have any guidance from the past? So, which is perhaps a good way to begin with the Orthodox opposition to Zionism, because they said Jews do have guides from the past, and these are the guides of Jewish tradition. Okay, the texts and the precepts with which we have lived provide us with the best tools to avoid the lures of that emancipation is giving, and also to steel ourselves against anti-Semitism. The kind of critical moment for the Orthodox opposition to Zionism begins actually in 1912, when at the Zionist Congress that year, the 10th Zionist Congress, the delegates decided that the Zionists would now do cultural work. Before, they had done political work, and they had done work buying land in Palestine, expropriating land in Palestine, but buying it. And they now, in 1912, said that they were going to do cultural work and work with the Jewish masses to build schools, to build camps, to create publications to try to win over the Jewish masses. For the Orthodox, this was throwing the gauntlet because cultural work was there. And they said there can be there's no such thing as Jewish culture without traditional Judaism. They were opposed to the idea of Zionism as a human agency that, in some ways, as they saw it, undermined basic precepts of Judaism. And they were appalled that the majority of the Zionists were secularists. And they said, what kind of society would they build without Torah? Okay, when the Orthodox, again, particularly through the Agudat Israel, which became a very powerful force in Poland, less so in the United States, but it was there as well, when it began its process of creating, again, a set of institutions to deal with the Zionist issue. And okay, I'm getting some weird static. Okay, but I'll go on. Anyhow, they saw that what they had to do was create an alternative to Zionism. So I'm just going to give one quote from one of these Orthodox leaders, and this was a rabbi who came to the United States in 1907, Rabbi Gavriel Zev Margolis, who had pulpits in Boston and in New York. And he said that the Zionists were nothing other than false messiahs. Okay, God will send at the end of the day his Redeemer only to those who wait for him and no one else. As he took us out of Egypt, so he will show us miracles soon and in his own days. On a practical level, the schools, publications of the Orthodox, again, there were Orthodox Zionists, but for the majority of Zionists, preached against Zionism and refused to participate with the Zionists in community endeavors. Okay, and there'll be some important exceptions. So that's one way. It's saying, look, we have something. We don't need Le'an. Where should we go? We go into Torah. We go into the world of our texts and our tradition. Now, the other swath of opponents of Zionism, which I again labeled the integrationists, which essentially or was heavily associated with reform, just rejected the idea of Zionism completely. And when they would answer the question, Le'an, where should we go? They'd say, here. We are here in France, we're here in Germany, we're here in England, and we don't need to go anyplace else because of their commitment to being where they were and this, by the way, will have an interesting echo with the Bund, who says the same thing, but for different reasons. It is these integrationist Jews, in particularly the United States, who were the most associated with progressive politics, that is, pro civil rights since the beginning of the 20th century, pro union, anti child labor, pro women's rights, pro birth control, pro state regulation of the economy, pro civil liberties, in order to make American society better, partly to protect the Jews. Okay, their conferences, their publications were full of statements that make it very clear we're not going anyplace else. So the most important document in the history of American reform was the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, and these were the reform rabbis, and they declared, quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and we therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any laws concerning a Jewish state." Now, one of the reasons these integrationists were so adamantly anti-Zionist is that they thought it was sending the absolutely worst message to their American and English and German and French co-citizens who were not Jewish. They were saying they feared that Zionism was saying we Jews don't really consider ourselves American or English or British, English or French. We consider ourselves Jews, and we have another place. And so when the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, when the British government decided it had the right to promise some kind of homeland to the Zionists, the documents still, this was pressure from British Jewry, from some of the leaders of British Jewry. They said, we're issuing this, but we have to make sure we are not, this does not imply any kind of prejudice to the civil and religious rights of Jews in the countries where they reside. In the American context, people like Louis Marshall, who was the preeminent leader of the American Jewish Committee, and really probably the most important figure in Jewish political action in the first part of the 20th century, Julius Rosenwald, and so many others who created institutions, funded institutions, labored assiduously for Jewish integration in America, both saw Zionism as a threat to the status of the Jews in the United States. They were roundly condemned by the Zionists, because here were the most powerful, the wealthiest, the most connected Jews, and again, particularly through the American Jewish Committee, and they were opposing Zionism. So, as with everything else, I could only give one just really juicy example, I think, of this kind of opposition, both the opposition to Zionism, the pursuing of other projects for Jewish rights, and then the Zionist reaction to this. So, first, I should say, in the 1920s, the Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, which was, while there were Zionists involved in it, it was largely run by anti-Zionists, sent vast amounts of money for the rebuilding of Jewish community life in Poland and elsewhere in Central Europe after the devastation of World War I. And the Zionists were furious. Why are you rebuilding Jewish life in Poland? Send that money to Palestine. Okay, and they would not participate in those efforts. So too, and here's just again one example of this, in the 1920s, Julius Rosenwald, who was a very important philanthropist and kind of figure in American Jewish life, created something called the Agro Joint. Now, he created this in the context of the fact that the Soviet Union, okay, product of the Russian Revolution in 1917, 1918, the Soviet Union had banned commerce. Okay, it makes sense, right? It's communist government, and this is something that was not surprising, but it was a quandary for the millions of Jews living now in the Soviet Union who had, in fact, been eking out a life in commerce. Okay, what do they do when commerce is illegal and they have made a living as selling things. So Julius Rosenwald, Felix Warburg, and any number of others of these integrationist, reform-oriented Jews came up with a scheme called AgroJoint, and to the tune of about $30 million, they sent money to the Soviet Union to build Jewish farming colonies in Ukraine and the Crimea, on the idea that these former peddlers and shopkeepers would now become farmers. Maybe it was a chimera, but the fact is it was $30 million, which they used to buy land, send supplies, train teachers, nurses, to hospitals, and so on, to let the Jews of the Soviet Union accommodate to new realities. Stephen Wise, one of the leaders of American Jewry, of American Zionism, wrote in his diary on the day that the announcement was made that this $30 million was going to the Soviet Union to help the Jews of particularly Ukraine. He said, with the stroke of a pen on his checkbook, Julius Rosenwald destroyed the Jewish people. Okay, so fierce was was that kind of antagonism. The idea of doing anything for Jews elsewhere was an affront to the Zionist project. But people like Rosenwald held very strong, and organizations like the American Jewish Committee, which had begun as decidedly non-Zionist, and many of its leaders were quite profoundly anti-Zionist, really does not begin to make the shift towards a Zionist position until the 1960s. Okay, and then finally, the third, shall we say, iteration, or the third swath of the Jewish opposition to Zionism came from the socialist left. Okay, and I need not tell you that socialism, an ideology born of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of a industrial proletariat, saw as its mission, very broad strokes, to convince the working masses that their future lay in solidarity with each other and not with narrow ethnic, racial, or national categories. Okay, after all, the opening words of the Communist Manifesto was "Workers of the world unite," not "Workers of the world separate off to your warrens and your homelands." So we can tell this Jewish part of this story from the perspective of the Bund, which was founded ironically in 1897, the same year that the Zionist Congress is called. The first Zionist Congress was called, and it was a political party. And its initial purpose was not Jewish culture, but the organization of the Jewish proletariat in Russia, Poland, Lithuania. It was decidedly secular, and it, by the time, again, elections are held in Poland, which I referred to before, after the creation of the first Polish Republic, the second Polish Republic, I'm sorry, after World War I, the Bund did really well politically. I mean, it polled a lot of votes. It polled more than the Aguda, and it polled more than the Zionists. More than the Zionists. So, now, many Bundists came to the United States, as Helen said very eloquently in her opening remarks. And it was here that, in fact, the Bund really took on a somewhat different approach, or an ancillary approach, which is it began as in its efforts to organize Jewish workers, it tried to take on the creation of Jewish and particularly Yiddish culture in America, defining Yiddish as the Jews' national language. So they were not opposed to the language of the Jews as a nation, but they said that nation, which had to work in harmony with other nations, was a nation that spoke Yiddish and not Hebrew. And Hebrew, the revival of Hebrew, was one of the major projects of the Zionist movement. For the question of La'an, where should we go to? The Bund, like the integrationist Reform Jews, had an answer here. And they, in fact, called it Dogkeit. Okay? It is the essence of being here. And being here meant focusing on solving the challenges confronting Jews in the countries where they lived versus the there-ness, okay, of the Zionist movement, which posited the necessity of an independent Jewish polity in the land of Israel. And the Bund is saying, both in the United States and in Poland and elsewhere, that the culture that the Bund and the Jews through Yiddish can create is as authentic and solid as the kind of culture that the Zionists envisioned would be created in the state of Israel. So, in the context of language, culture, and Dogkite, the Bund and the organizations pivoting around it, even those like the Worker Circle, which was not formally part of the Bund, but many of its founders were Bundists, were created a set of institutions that Yiddish speaking summer camps, Yiddish schools, Yiddish publications. They even founded an institute and launched a pedagogic journal for the teachers of Yiddish. So they really saw this as a very serious enterprise. Okay, so the Bund and its American ancillary institutions saw the Zionist project as one that was at odds with the needs and goals of the and best interests of the Jewish people. Now, I would say that when we look at these three swaths, the Orthodox, the integrationist, and the Bund, the Orthodox, in their critique of Zionism, had nothing to say about the fact that there were other people living in that piece of land which the Zionists wanted to make their homeland. The integrationists, or some of them, Louis Marshall was one, and Julius Rosenwald was another, who, in their critique, when they explained why they were not Zionists, and they were often forced to explain this, they said there are other people living there, and that it would be an impossible situation to export and to place a fundamentally European population, a non-indigenous population, into into a land that was inhabited by other people who they mostly called Arabs. We would use the word Palestinians, but that was not going to be at all. It was a recipe for disaster. Rosenwald, in fact, interestingly, supported some projects in Palestine. He gave money to some projects in Palestine, particularly those that seemed to bring Arabs and Jews together. So he was a big supporter of the medical clinics of Hadassah, because although it was a Zionist organization, it dispensed medical care to Arabs, and he was fine giving money to that. But he would give money to no project that he thought had any vision of Jews taking over the land. And as for the members of the Bund, okay, and the leftist position, I'm going to read you a quote from a Bund leader, Henrik Ehrlich, who wrote this in October 1938, very late date, and he wrote this in a New York Yiddish newspaper. He himself was part of the left Zionist, but he certainly, as somebody who comes from the Bund, was very sensitive, expressed some really powerful opposition to this kind of to Zionism in a kind of deeply, in a broadly thoughtful way. And he wrote, "When Zionists speak to the non-Jewish world, they are outstanding Democrats." Okay, when Zionists speak to the outside world, they are outstanding Democrats, and they present the conditions in today's and future Palestine as exemplary of liberty and progress. But if a Jewish state is to be founded in Palestine, its spiritual climate will be, okay, an eternal fear of an external enemy, Arabs, unending fighting for every little piece of land, for every scrap of work, against the internal enemy, parentheses, Arabs. Is this the kind of climate in which freedom, democracy, and progress can flourish? is it not the climate in which reactionism and chauvinism can typically germinate? So, I think my time is coming to a close, so I'm going to just try to wrap this up and say that these three streams of opposition to Zionism, which grew out of the same concerns and the same, shall we say, fears of the Zionists, is what was going to happen to the Jewish people in this new world of emancipation and anti Semitism. Okay, all dealing with the same issue, again, Le'an. The three streams of opposition to Zionism all course through Jewish communal life well into the in fact, 50s and even 1960s. They were all there in their institutions. They were all there in their publications, and all there articulating an agenda for the Jewish people. And for these three streams, Zionism and Israel were just not part of it, or they saw it as an impediment. All of those who swam in these three streams, despite the radical difference between one and the other, all of them manifested a deep commitment to Jews and Judaism. Okay, and unlike what I heard at the Anti-Semitism Commission and what I've read in the IHRA, the understanding that Judaism, that's defense of the Jews and defense of Israel, are twinned. These three groups, their advocates, manifested a deep commitment to Jews and Judaism. All used their time, energy, resources to create Jewish institutions in Europe and in America, which is our main concern, which they believed would do the most to further Jewish communal life and foster loyalty to Jewishness. All of them answered that question of La'an in ways that had no room for the Zionist vision. Now, this could be continued, and again, I direct your attention to Marjorie Feld's Limits of Dissent, but the history of the Jews in this tumultuous period was as much laced with a particular strand of orthodoxy, reform integrationism, and left Bundism as it was with Zionism. So I hope this gives you food for thought and food for contemplation, the questions that Helen has sent out. So thank you.
Thank you, Hasia. We have a few questions in the Q&A. I'm going to lead off with one that the organizing team came up with. The question is, at what point in your career as a scholar did you begin to research this history that you've told us about tonight? What was the catalyst for your interest in this history?
Okay, so I'm a scholar of American Jewish history, and I was always struck by how my, shall I say, fellow, but I don't mean that in a gendered way, practitioners of American Jewish history, when they wrote about those people who opposed Zionism, they always felt the need to somehow psychoanalyze them, as they were somehow, there was something wrong with them, that they were self-haters, that they were that they were ashamed of being Jewish, and the like. And it always seemed just a little off, because I thought, how could one say that about Louis Marshall, who had his hands in every endeavor that was there, was some successful and some not, but basically to enrich Jewish life. And he was just boldly Jewish. And then in the early 2000s, I was asked to write the biography of Julius Rosenwald for the Jewish Lives series. And here it hit me in the face. There was nothing self-hating about this man. He wore his Jewishness proudly on his sleeve, and he was constantly, whenever he would hear something that was disturbing to him about an act of anti Semitism or this, that, or the other, he would immediately use whatever resources he had to find out, well, what was really going on. He, more than probably than almost any other American Jew, was trying to get the defense of Leo Frank. And to fund that defense. So he was so concerned about everything about the Jew and about the Jews, Jewish culture, Jewish defense, Jewish rights, and there was nothing pathological or self-hating about him. And I thought, would it not be a very reasonable to go back and look at all these other people who have been defined in pathological terms and see what was making them tick? What was it about Zionism that caused them to say, no, that's not the solution. That seems to me the best way to approach the current and future status of the Jews.
Okay, a question from the Q&A. Um, um, how did each of these three groups react to the Holocaust? Did their positions on Zionism change?
Okay, so yeah, so I mean, it's very interesting. The reform movement, if we can use that as a good example, in 1938, in its Columbus platform, so it was in a way a revisiting of Pittsburgh from 1885, did say that there should be a Jewish homeland for the refugees. Okay, because this is the moment where the Jews of Germany, Austria, well, there isn't Czechoslovakia are on the move, and anti-Semitism has just so flared in Poland, and there are Jews looking for places of refuge. But the movement is not saying a state; it is saying a place of refuge. Okay, but you could see that was sort of the beginning of a journey. But it's not, but there is still opposition to Zionism and to the kind of adulation of the state of Israel in the reform movement well into the 1940s and 1950s. Um, uh, so that it's obviously the Holocaust was something the people who I was talking about couldn't possibly have foreseen. Okay, nobody could foresee it, and it did completely reorient the idea that there was a possibility, say in Poland, of Dawkite. Okay, there is no more Daw here. Okay, the Jews of Poland are slaughtered, and the skeletal community that was left was plagued by anti-Semitism in the immediate, years after the war, even after the Germans are defeated. So it did cause rethinking, but it didn't necessarily mean that American Jews became Zionists. And again, in the after the war, 1940, in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, a majority of American Jews did not belong to Zionist organizations. They didn't. They belonged to synagogues. They belonged to JCCs. They belonged to a B'nai B'rith chapter, but they didn't belong to Zionist organizations in the main. So it changed, but not in a way as radically. And most historians will say that it was really the '67 war that served as a turning point, and that again, I think, is something such an enormous subject of how that happened.
Okay, let me pick another question here. Um, could you maybe address how the rise of anti-Semitism in Poland impacted the Bund after World War One?
Okay, so that's a great question. I actually saw that in the chat. I slightly have my eye on the chat, but I actually don't want to get distracted by it. Well, it's really interesting because once when you say Poland, remember there's no Poland before World War One. It's only after World War One that an independent Polish state comes into being, and the Polish leadership, is kind of like, what do we do with 3 million Jews? It was like, and one Polish statesman said, if I wouldn't want 3 million Danes in Poland, this is a Polish state, and yet it was highly nationalist, just like Zionism was nationalist. And so, as really by 1935, Poland really begins to become really quite profoundly and blatantly anti-Semitic. And the Polish government is actually funding Zionism because their goal is to get the Jews to leave. And so that's in a way part of the story is that many of the opponents of Zionism say, wait a minute, other people want us to leave, and we're actually we don't want to. Okay, we want to, try to, we're here, we're Poles, we vote in Polish elections, we speak Polish, and yet it was the Polish government was funding, in fact, the most right wing Zionist organizations and creating, in fact, little quasi military units for young men. In fact, Menachem Begin, as a teenager, participated in one of these state-supported right-wing Zionist militia groups. Okay, the idea is they're going to be trained and then they'd leave, and then we won't have these 3 million Jews here. So the Bund is fighting an uphill battle in the 30s. The 20s, they're doing really well. But again, even in the late 30s, the Bund still captures the Jewish vote. So they recognize the anti-Semitism. They see that anti-Semitism is going to be solved by the ending of class disparity and bringing into being class equity, and not fleeing off to some other place.
Um, can you compare the Orthodox opposition to Zionism of the 20s and 30s to that of a contemporary group like uh
The
I don't know
Notori,
how to pronounce it.
the Notori,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Notori
yeah.
Karta. Well, they're very much the same thing, and in some ways, and in a kind of let's ironic or not, they are the best answer to the IHRA folks, in as much as you couldn't possibly say these people were anti-Semites or they didn't care, they didn't deeply identify with the Jewish culture, Jewishness. I mean, that is their entire lives. And yet they can say, this is wrong. Okay, this is godless. This is some of the Notori Karta propaganda echoing what some of the Aguda people said in the 1920s, said it's a pact with Satan. Israel, Zionism is a pact with Satan, and it's the worst thing that could happen to the Jewish people. So it's a straight line, and I myself am not Orthodox, but I have a tremendous appreciation for that consistency. They had a view, a belief in the way the world worked, and it worked, and it was for Jewish life was to be based on a set of deeply instilled principles, and it didn't matter what else happened. That principle of staying true to the Torah is what mattered. And yes, I see somebody comes in with a question about the Agudah entering the government in Israel. I know I'm jumping ahead of the Q&A, and that's why I probably shouldn't have it on. And I'm
No,
gonna
that's all right.
okay.
You can pick
But
questions.
yeah, I mean, look at they're opportunists like anyone else, and what the government of the state of Israel can do for the Agudah, that is money. Okay, for their yeshivas, monies for their other institutions, and deferment of yeshiva students from the military, and sustaining their way of life through public monies. So it's still with it. They are still an anti-Zionist party, despite participating in the government.
This is a question for me. And in our where we are today, I'm very sort of taken by this idea of here-ness, and the fact that in Europe today, there's at least, for instance, I, as a descendant of a Holocaust refugee from Austria, have regained my Austrian citizenship, and I think that's gone on with Germany and maybe some other European countries, and also the large portion of Jewish population that's in the United States. So do you see a way to take this idea of here-ness as an opposing idea to the blending of Judaism and Zionism that is sort of popular amongst the legacy Jewish organizations, and use that as a counter, like building a diaspora view that could
Right.
could
Yeah.
counter that.
So, I mean, there are lots of things in your questions, and if we had like a long time to talk, but I would say one of the interesting, again, I see elements, again, particularly for the integrationists and for the left, in terms of their opposition to Zionism, was they were speaking in part to the anti Semites. And they're saying, don't say that we're not real Poles. Don't say that we're not real Americans. We're as American as you are. We just happen to be Jewish. Okay, and we have this. This is part of our lives, but we're Frenchmen, we're Englishmen, and they are saying to those to the anti-Semites, you have no right to question our legitimacy in this place. Okay. And now it's not that they were opposed to immigration. I mean, obviously, they didn't try to prevent Jews from leaving Poland and coming to the United States or going to Australia or wherever. But I think that one of the kind of issues you bring up is I know very few people who, at least in the world I travel in, I know people are trying, my children are trying to reclaim Polish citizenship, but none of them are saying, I want to move to Israel. Okay. I think that in the last, there's begun, I think, starting with the work of the historian Jonathan Boyarin and also David Kramer, Shaul Magid, a sense that let's look at the diaspora. And the Zionists wanted to, quote, negate it and eliminate it. But for one thing, they couldn't, and it was disastrous, much of what they did. But the fact is, Judaism as we know it, everything we know about Judaism is a product of the diaspora. Okay, everything was created in the diaspora. Hasidism, Kabbalah, mysticism, Zionism is created in the diaspora. Everything is a product. The Talmud is a product of the diaspora. It's written in Babylonia. So that the notion that there's such a thing as Judaism stripped of the diaspora was wrong. I mean, it was just wrong, empirically, and a kind of false sort of goal to try to pursue.
No, that's interesting. Um, Somebody asks, do you have recommendations for further reading on Jewish opposition to Zionism in the European Jewish community?
Oh, I mean, there's so much, and in a way, sitting here without a bibliography in front of me, I'm going to be sort of. I could, if the whoever sent it in would want to write to me, I'd be happy to
Well,
send them some
wait,
titles.
if you send it to me, I'll send it
Yes,
out to all the
sure,
participants.
but you'd have to remind me.
All right. We can do that. Let me see here. What else do we have? Um, there's a question about uh, and ask that you comment on the other regions besides Palestine that were proposed for a Zionist state.
Right. Okay. So, because again, obviously, the situation for the Jews of Europe, okay, and the United States was really not even remotely part of this, was really dire. And it was dire both in terms of anti-Semitism, and it was dire in terms of in the Russian Empire increased impoverishment, and so there were people there was a movement called territorialism, and their idea was to create some kind of to negotiate with the imperial powers to get some piece of land someplace. Madagascar was once talked about, and obviously we know about Uganda. Okay, and so some of the Zionists thought that was actually not a bad idea. Without thinking about the fact that there were kind of people living in Uganda as well, and that was going to be difficult, but. Uh, and they were mostly the territorialists were rejected by and excoriated by the Zionist movement because, as they saw it, there was only one place. Okay, and that's why I said at the beginning that the Zionists had, despite their secularism, this very deep theological notion that there was a kind of spiritual bond between the Jews and that particular spot on the globe. And it wasn't just about Jewish safety. Okay, and it wasn't, but it was about becoming an authentic people, or that, and becoming, and just as I said, the Irish have Ireland, and the Czechs have should have Czechoslovakia, and the Poles have Poland. Again, this is in the heyday of European nationalism, where all these countries are, all these peoples, not countries, are saying we deserve a state. I said, well, Jews too, and we have an authentic state. Are you going to send all the Irish, to Boston? Are you going to send them all? Should the British Empire should England send all the British to Australia? No. They said the Irish nationalists said this is our place. And so the Zionists say, look, at the Bible tells us, our prayers tell, even though these may be people who are no longer praying and don't believe in the, inerrancy and literalism of the Bible. But in the Bible, that this was our land that God, who they don't necessarily believe in, promised to us. Okay.
All right, I think we're going to stop there. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but there's always more. And we're going to go into breakout sessions where we'll put people into groups of 5. So I'm going to post the breakout questions in the chat, and we have 2. One is, how does what you learned tonight impact your own ideas and feelings about Jewish identity, Israel, and Zionism? And the second one is, how could we bring what we learned tonight to the fight against the conflation of the opposition to Zionism with anti-Semitism, and to the struggle to protect pro-Palestinian speech critical of Israel, and free speech in general? We'll be in the breakout groups for about 20 minutes. I want to just tell you, when we come back, we're going to have a few minutes for people to post their ideas, thoughts about action, for questions that need to be further looked into, especially in response to the second breakout question. And we want to capture that for further action and activities that the Israel-Palestine Committee might take. So we'll do the breakout sessions for 20 minutes. We'll come back and have a short closing with a very worthwhile poem. So I hope people will stick around. Hasi's going to stick around. She'll be in one of the breakout groups. So, Roz, are you ready to go?
Yep, everyone's been invited to the breakout rooms.
Okay. And I think I have to put myself in one. I see a bunch of people that are unassigned, Roz. If you didn't get invited to a breakout room, you can click on the breakout room, click on more, click on breakout rooms, and pick one that doesn't have 5 people in it yet, maybe to join. I'm seeing, so Nancy, Victor, Robert, Ruby.
More doesn't have
That-
breakout
yeah.
rooms in mine.
Yeah, mine neither.
Yeah, I think it might be an administrative feature that the rest of us don't have access to.
Okay, Roz, do you think you can do something about these folks that are unassigned?
You're muted, Ross.
Okay, I think Roz is slowly putting people into groups.
Are you still sending people to breakout rooms? Because in
Yeah,
group
I've been invited to one.
4, we only had a couple of people.
Yes, there are more. Room 4 shows more people than that. Some of them haven't joined though.
Was in room 6 and then no one else was there, so I left.
Yeah, I think some people might have dropped off. You want to come to 4, Mitchell?
Okay. If you're there, that sounds like Beth. I can't tell who's talking. If you're there, Beth, I'll go there.
Thanks, Mitch.
Someone has
And
to
how
send
do
me there.
Yeah, Roz is sending people. Just be patient. Everybody's been assigned now, but some of you haven't accepted the assignments.
Well, I accepted it, but then I left it, so she may have think she put me there already because there's no one there.
Yeah, you're still showing as room 6, Mitchell.
Anyone else showing in 6?
Yeah, Nancy Weschler. I can join you in room 6. I have to join one.
Whatever. Send me to
But
4 or 6.
I'm trying to make sure these other folks are.
Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, I was the only person in room 6, so.
Yeah. Why don't you and
You
Mitchell go
have to
back?
go back, Mitchell and Nancy, because the room is there and I cannot do anything about getting you there. So you have to go join.
How do you go join after you left?
Well, if it's just going to be Mitch and I, that doesn't make sense.
No, I'll join you. You need to go back first.
Well, um, join breakout. Okay.
I'm going to join
There
you.
is a way now to say to join the breakout group, but
That's what you should do.
Can you give instructions how to do it?
It's like a pop-up on your screen someplace. Same with,
Nancy did it. I should be able to do it. I don't see it.
All right, I'm coming.
I don't know how, there's nothing I can do about that.
Okay, sure. I'm just look for more. Okay, I thought join breakout. Okay, I got it.
Oh my God.
The breakout room. Oh, we don't need to record this.